The world is very big, and it's no secret that it's full of mysteries. So from mysterious disappearances to one of the best documented cases of an alien abduction, here are 5 unsolved mysteries. One of the great mysteries of cinema history doesn't take place on the big screen, but rather occurs off camera at the very beginning of the story of the moving image. The tale of Louis le Prince, the man regarded as the father of cinematography, ends in rather peculiar circumstances which have yet to be resolved. Le Prince was born in France in 1841, and had the fortune during his youth of regularly visiting a studio belonging to a friend of his father, the photographic inventor Jacques Daguerre. After studying chemistry and physics at university, Le Prince moved to England at the invitation of John Whiteley, before establishing the Leeds Technical School of Art where he specialised in tinting and firing of photographic images. During the late 1880s, however, Le Prince became fascinated with the early cinematic technologies which were being developed. In 1886, he created a 16-lens camera and applied for an American patent on November 2nd of the same year, receiving this at the beginning of 1888. On the 16th of November 1888, he received a British patent for his invention. On September 16th, 1890, Le Prince was visiting his brother in Dijon, France before boarding a train to Paris. When the train arrived at its destination, Le Prince had completely vanished. The last time anyone saw Le Prince, he was entering his cabin after having checked his luggage into a separate compartment. Neither Le Prince nor his luggage were ever seen again. There have been no signs of foul play or anything suspicious during the trip, and no one could recall seeing Le Prince outside his cabin. The windows were tightly closed, so it would have been difficult for him to jump off the train, but suicide seems an unlikely option since Le Prince was planning to travel to America. His ultimate fate still remains a mystery. The year was 1980. For months, Dorothy Jane Scott, a 32-year-old single mother, had been getting anonymous phone calls at her place of work. She couldn't recognise the voice, which swung from telling her how much he loved her to threatening unspeakable violence. The caller told her he was following her, and described details of her day-to-day life to prove it. Dorothy began studying karate to help protect herself. She even considered buying a handgun, but neither of these things would save her. On the 28th of May, after taking a fellow employee to the ER for treatment of a spider bite, Dorothy left the lobby to go and get her car. Her companions waited for her to arrive, but it took quite a while. When they finally spotted her car, it was travelling at a high rate of speed, and promptly took a sharp right out of the parking lot. They were left puzzling over Dorothy's strange behaviour. They thought that maybe she needed to get her son or there was an emergency of her own. Except several hours later, Dorothy's car was found about 10 miles away in an alley. It was burning and abandoned, and there was no trace of Dorothy to be found. Dorothy's family was advised to stay quiet about her disappearance in regards to the media. A week after she went missing, her mother Vera received a phone call. "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" When she replied yes, the caller said, "I've got her," then hung up. This taunting behaviour repeated as weeks went on. The same caller would tease her family about having Dorothy and confess to a radio station, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott, she was my love." He went on to describe details that hadn't been released to the press. Dorothy's red scarf she wore that night and her co-worker's spider bite. The calls finally stopped in 1984. Almost 4 months later, a construction worker discovered both dog and human remains in a wooded area. With the bones were a turquoise ring and a watch that had stopped at May 29, 1980 at 12:30 am. Dorothy's mother identified the ring as having belonged to her daughter. A week after the bones had been identified as Dorothy Scott, and an announcement was run in the local newspaper, her family got 2 more calls from the same mysterious caller, asking only in a knowing voice, "Is Dorothy home?" Her killer was never identified. Bouvet Island is the most isolated, uninhabited place on Earth. Bouvet Island is situated between the tip of Africa and the coldest continent on Earth. It's not the sort of place where it's likely you'd find yourself shipwrecked. It's hard for even people who know where it is to find it. How is it then that an expedition discovered an abandoned lifeboat on Bouvet Island? Only the most adventurous visit the island. Most modern expeditions onto the island are made by helicopter, because landing a boat on Bouvet Island is difficult under the best conditions, and impossible under average conditions. It's 90% covered by glaciers, under which is an active volcano. The sides of the island are almost all sheer icy cliffs. Because of its location, weather researchers have long thought it was a great place to put a weather tower. In 1964, Lieutenant Commander Alan Crawford was sent to the island to investigate a new area of the land, created by lava flow 10 years prior to the expedition. He and his team landed via helicopter and began checking out the landscape. There, Crawford saw a lagoon with a very strange feature, an abandoned lifeboat. Crawford later reported that the abandoned lifeboat on Bouvet Island had no markings on it that would suggest its origins. It also had no motor and no sails. He found the oars on shore along with a flattened copper tank and a barrel. He was unable to do a thorough search of the area, given the harsh nature of the terrain and the work he'd come out to do, but what he was able to search of the landscape turned up nothing else. There was no evidence that people had stayed on the island or died on the island. 2 years after Crawford's Bouvet Island expedition, another expedition did a survey of the area around the lagoon. They described the lagoon but made no mention of a lifeboat, so it must have disappeared by then, but where could it have gone? It's unlikely that another expedition would have retrieved it, as dragging an extra boat back into the water or bringing a lifeboat onto a helicopter are far-fetched scenarios. There is the possibility that it sank into the lagoon. However, without knowing how deep the lagoon is, it's hard to say. All we do know is that the lifeboat is gone. As for the origins of the lifeboat on Bouvet Island, no one has come forward to say it was theirs. It could have been left by an expedition, but the lagoon was no more than 10 years old, so there is only a small space of time during which the lifeboat could have appeared. Research into who visited Bouvet Island during that 10-year span has turned up nothing about an abandoned boat. Felipe Santos was driving to work in Naples, Florida on the morning of October 1st, 2003. On this particular occasion, he got into a minor accident with another vehicle. A sheriff's deputy named Stephen Henry Calkins cited Santos for driving without a license before putting him into his patrol car. However, Santos was never actually booked at the police station and has not been seen since. Calkins claimed that he changed his mind about taking Santos to jail and dropped him off at a nearby convenience store. 2 weeks later, after Calkins submitted his incident report, Santos's family filed a missing persons report as well as a complaint against Calkins. An investigation cleared Calkins of any wrongdoing. Santos's wife has questioned the quality of the investigation into her husband's disappearance, citing the fact that she was not interviewed by investigators. Calkins would find himself at the centre of another suspicious disappearance only 3 months later, when an African-American man named Terrance Williams went missing. After experiencing engine troubles with his car, Williams was pulled over by Calkins. Even though Williams was driving without a license and insurance, Calkins did not cite him, and once again his story was that he put Williams in his patrol car and dropped him off at a nearby convenience store. This time Calkins was caught in a lie when he claimed to have phoned the store to inquire about Williams, as phone records did not back up his story. The families of both missing men filed complaints against Calkins, and he was eventually fired by the department for lying. Notable figures like Tyler Perry have taken up the cause of finding out what happened to Santos and Williams, but there are still no answers. Because the main person of interest in the case was a police officer, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the FBI were called in to work on the case. Various other investigative techniques were used, including the covert placement of a GPS device on Calkins' vehicle and a forensic investigation of the patrol car. Dogs were used to survey the areas identified by the GPS, but these turned up no further evidence. Okay, this is a long one. It's the incredible story of Betty and Barney Hill. The first abduction case to be brought to the public's attention was back in 1961. Betty and Barney Hill reported seeing a UFO and experienced a period of missing time while on a long car journey. Under hypnosis, they both separately described how they were abducted by aliens and shown around the spacecraft before undergoing medical examinations. The story of Betty and Barney Hill begins in September 1961, in the state of New Hampshire. The couple had visited Niagara Falls, and on the 19th of that month they began their journey back home to Portsmouth. At about 10:15, 3 miles south of the city of Lancaster, Barney noticed what appeared to be a bright star or planet which seemed to move erratically. Barney pointed this out to Betty, and they both began to keep track of the object. The couple began to believe they were watching a plane appear and disappear, as the movement of their vehicle caused the trees to come and go in obstructing their view. Later, Barney would state that he tried to convince himself that the object was a plane, but Betty thought it to be something else, an unidentified craft of some kind. As they reached Indian Head, Barney actually stopped the car to take a look at the object with his binoculars. He saw multicolored lights and rows of windows on a flat-shaped object, which now seemed to be moving towards him. As the object moved within 100 feet of him, he could see occupants inside. Frightened, he ran back to the car where Betty waited. They climbed inside and sped away. Soon, 2 hours of their lives would vanish into oblivion. After resuming their journey home, they were not able to see the strange craft anymore. Oddly though, they heard a beeping sound. Then they heard the beeping sound a second time, noticing they were suddenly 35 miles farther down the road than a minute or two ago. The mood in the car was quiet as they proceeded home and went to bed. They both slept until the next afternoon. When Betty got up, she called her sister Janet and told her what happened. Janet told her to call the nearby Air Force base and report what she'd seen. Betty reported the incident, speaking to Major Paul Henderson, who told Betty the UFO was also confirmed by our radar. It's important to note that at this point Barney was against calling the sighting into the base, hoping to keep it quiet. At this time neither Betty or Barney recalled any abduction. Soon after, however, Betty began having nightmarish dreams of her and her husband being taken aboard a craft, against their will. In a matter of weeks, 2 writers got wind of the story, and after interviewing the Hills made an intensive log of the events of that night. They discovered that there were 2 hours of unaccounted time in the Hills story, even allowing for stops for the Hills and breaks for their dog, who had also made the trip with them. Their interview was attended by Major James McDonald, a former Air Force intelligence officer. After dodging reporters and doing some research on psychiatrists, the Hills made a decision to contact well-known Boston psychiatrist and neurologist Dr. Benjamin Simon, who was one of the most respected doctors in his field. After a couple of initial interviews, Dr. Simon's preliminary diagnosis was anxiety syndrome, relating to the incident of the night of September the 19th, 1961. His next step was to find out what those events were. The method of treatment that Dr. Simon chose for the Hills was regressive hypnosis, which was meant to get to the source of their problem, whatever that may have been. He began the sessions on Barney and then followed up with the same treatment for Betty. The process was slow, but after 6 months it was Dr. Simon's expert opinion that the Hills had been abducted and taken aboard an unknown flying craft on the night in question. After the many sessions with Dr. Simon, the following details became evident. The Hills related that their car had stalled, and then the alien craft landed on the road in front of their vehicle, forming a kind of roadblock. They were taken into the craft and given medical examinations by these aliens, and before being released were ordered under hypnosis not to recount any of the details of their incident. The entities were described by the Hills as bald-headed alien beings, about 5 foot tall with greyish skin, pear-shaped heads and slanting cat eyes. This was the very first mention in UFO folklore of the so-called Greys. The Hills were taken into separate rooms during their examinations. These tests involved both physical and mental procedures. As part of these tests, skin, hair and nail samples were taken. Betty had a long needle inserted into her navel and was told it was a pregnancy test. After these events, the Hills were taken back to their car, and the last thing they remembered was an orange glow that disappeared into the night sky. It's very important to note that the Hills tried to keep these events out of the press, but unfortunately inaccurate versions of the events was leaked to the press, after which the Hills decided to come forward with the true events of the case. Dr. Simon was under a great amount of pressure to release whatever information the Hills authorised about their case. This was considered prudent, not to exploit the story but to stop speculation that the absence of a statement by him would seem to shed a negative light on the Hills story. Simon concluded that the Hills were not fabricating their story. Betty asked one of her abductors where they were from, and in reply she was shown a star map. The map that Betty says she was shown was a 3-dimensional view with different sized dots. 3 stars in the clusters were unknown until 1969. Years later, researcher Marjorie Fish was able to find a unique matching set of nearby stars which fit the map. No astronomer on Earth knew their position in 1963, yet Betty Hill drew a map of these stars in 1963. The story of Betty and Barney Hill is captivating to say the least. It would seem extremely unlikely that 2 sane people who were driving to their home simultaneously had the same illusion. So that was 5 unsolved mysteries. Let me know what your theories are on these mysterious cases. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.